All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to be tracing the absolute dark underbelly of America's rapid industrialization. We're looking closely at the real human cost of all this progress, tracking exactly how the country moved from post-Civil War Reconstruction straight into a highly industrialized yet deeply, deeply fractured society.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the post-war illusion, move into Ford and the Flivver King, look at the reality of wage labor, cover the uprising of the 20,000, examine the corporate grip, and finally wrap up with the Little Bohemia shootout.
Part 1. The post-war illusion, setting the stage for American industry. Let's see how all this built up out of the ashes of a divided nation.
Okay, so right after the Civil War ended and President Andrew Johnson officially declared peace in Texas back in 1866, America was in desperate need of a total identity rebuild. They rallied hard around this concept of freedom and liberty, and nothing really symbolized this better than the Statue of Liberty project by the French abolitionist Édouard de la Boulaye. It was this massive, grand tribute to democracy, with its hand and torch proudly displayed in New York in the 1880s.
But, we really have to ask ourselves a crucial question here. Did those grand, highly idealistic promises of freedom actually match the grim, day-to-day reality for the millions of people who were just about to step onto the factory floor of this huge new industrial age?
Well, that brings us right to Section 2, Ford and the Flivver King, the American dream industrialized. This is where we see the massive boom of the Second Industrial Revolution completely reshaping the American landscape.
To really grasp the reality of this intense new industrial efficiency, we can look at Upton Sinclair's incredibly impactful book, The Flivver King. The human cost here was just staggering. Workers weren't just getting tired, they were driven until they were quite literally punch drunk. Henry Ford had this notorious speed-up department that relentlessly, and I mean relentlessly, pushed the pace for maximum output, often just completely ignoring basic safety. In fact, there was actually a grim saying around the plant that this brutal efficiency cost about one life a day.
So you've got this massive clash, right? On one side, there's this heavily marketed American dream, the consumerism, the shiny new automobiles, the promise of 2 cars in every garage. But then on the flip side, you have the actual workers' reality. People were basically commodified, treated as just pure exchange value on a terrifyingly fast speed-up belt. It was an incredibly unsafe workplace where human lives, frankly, came second to hitting those massive production quotas.
But hey, from a pure production standpoint, it worked like a charm. On May 26, 1927, Henry Ford and his son Edsel actually drove the 15 millionth Model T right out of their factory. 15 million! That number alone absolutely cements the mind-boggling scale of this new capitalism. It totally accelerated the automobile's role in society, but man, it came at a severe human cost.
All right, Section 3, the reality of wage labor, the true cost of production. Let's dig into some historical labor reports to see who is actually footing the bill for all this so-called efficiency. To really understand where the workers stood, researchers point to this super fascinating parallel with the Elizabethan era. Think back to William Shakespeare's acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. They had a very strict hierarchy. You had sharers who actually owned a stake and pocketed the profits, and then you had hirelings who just took home a flat weekly wage. Well, the modern factory system perfectly mirrored this exact setup. It basically guaranteed that millions of workers were locked in as permanent, totally disposable hirelings who would never ever see a real slice of those massive profits they were churning out. Now take a really close look at this grim government data from the early 1900s. And keep in mind, we're not just talking about adult workers here. We are talking about child labor. Just look at the larceny rate for delivery boys. It's over 60%. Actually, wait, let that sink in. Over 60%. When you take children, trust them with money, and throw them into completely unregulated, high-pressure environments, they were systematically pushed right into criminal behavior.
And when investigators started isolating the offenses that were directly connected to a kid's occupation, the numbers were still just staggering. 52% for street vendors, 38% for delivery boys. So this system wasn't just exploiting kids for cheap labor, it was actively fracturing their moral development and basically feeding them straight into the justice system.
Moving on to Section 4, Uprising of the 20,000, Women Push Back. Because, as you'd guess, the workers didn't just stay quiet. And that brings us to a major historical flashpoint. There is such a fascinating shift in how society viewed women during this era. Back in 1893, Lizzie Borden was actually acquitted of murder, and a huge part of that was because society completely bought into the stereotype of the sly sex, this idea that a woman was just way too delicate and refined to ever commit a brutal act. But then, fast forward just over a decade to the 1909 shirtwaist strike, and working-class women completely shattered that illusion. They proved they were incredibly fierce, stepping right up to the industrial front lines to loudly demand their basic rights.
So, during that 1909 strike, these working-class immigrant women are out there demanding better conditions, and the factory owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, responded absolutely ruthlessly. They actually hired thugs and even prostitutes to assault the strikers, and they were bribing the police. But then, this completely unlikely alliance forms. The Women's Trade Union League brings in what was called the Mink Brigade. These were incredibly wealthy women, like Alpha Belmont and J.P. Morgan's own daughter, Anne Tracy Morgan. And when these ultra-rich women started standing on the picket lines and getting themselves arrested, well, you better believe it made front-page news. It totally forced society to finally pay attention to what these workers were going through.
Which leads us to Section 5, the corporate grip, commodified and consumed. Because despite these totally fierce labor uprisings, corporate power really only tightened its grip as the 20th century rolled on.
These corporations grew so massive that their influence went way, way beyond the factory floor. Workers were completely commodified, essentially valued for nothing but their output, and simultaneously, this whole ideology of consumerism was being pushed so hard, practically encouraging families to just bury themselves in debt to participate in normal society. And the staggering wealth this generated, it allowed these companies to project their power globally. I mean, by 1950, you had massive car companies like Chrysler and Dodge literally bankrolling international expeditions, like the ones led by Wendell Phillips, the guy they called America's Lawrence of Arabia, all the way over in Yemen.
And there's this quote from Henry Ford that I think brilliantly sums up the new capitalism of that era. Industrialists were actively pushing the working class to just constantly buy things. By convincing folks that spending their money, not saving it, was the real path to getting rich, the system kept workers perpetually strapped, constantly in debt, and totally trapped inside the industrial machine.
All right, Section 6, the Little Bohemia Shootout, the fracture. This is our final section, and it's where the sheer desperation of the working class violently collides with the extremely lucrative criminal underworld that was spawned by the 18th Amendment. By the 1930s, the social fallout of Prohibition, mixed with all this industrial exploitation, just completely exploded into a massive crime wave.
We can actually track one of the absolute most infamous moments of this societal fracture: the FBI's completely botched raid on the John Dillinger gang. So on April 20th, 1934, Dillinger's crew rolls up to Emil Waneka's Little Bohemia Lodge up in Wisconsin. 2 days later, the FBI gets a tip. But instead of, planning things out carefully, Agent Melvin Purvis and his guys just rush in that night. They didn't even bother to notify the local authorities, and they ended up disastrously ambushing a car full of completely innocent lodge customers.
The chaos that followed just highlighted absolute law enforcement ineptitude. The FBI mistakenly shoots and kills a civilian, Eugene Busnow, and they leave the entire back of the lodge completely unguarded. So Dillinger and his top guys just literally slip right out into the woods. Meanwhile, the notoriously unhinged babyface Nelson attacks the agents head-on. He ended up killing Agent Carter Baum, who, incredibly tragically, had left his gun on safety, and Nelson actually manages to escape the scene by driving off in a stolen FBI car. You just cannot make this stuff up.
As you can imagine, the fallout from this was just monumental. You've got a civilian dead, a federal agent dead, others severely wounded, and the entire Dillinger gang is successfully hiding out in the wilderness. The public was absolutely outraged. There were these massive petitions going around demanding that Melvin Purvis be suspended and that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover resign immediately.
The authorities basically became a national laughingstock. I mean, since the whole Dillinger gang vanished into thin air, the only people the FBI actually managed to capture were the 3 girlfriends left behind at the lodge, including babyface Nelson's wife. And that birthed this incredibly mocking popular saying at the time: the Bureau may not always get its man, but it always gets his woman. It was just such a stark, brutal highlight of a deeply fractured, heavily armed society where the institutions of order, already totally battered by the fallout of Prohibition and nonstop industrial strife, were just utterly, utterly failing.
So we're going to leave you with this final thought for today's explainer. When we look back at the immense, staggering wealth generated during this whole era, we really have to also look at the juvenile delinquency, those exhausted, punch-drunk factory workers, the desperate strikes, and the violent, chaotic outbursts of the 1930s. We really urge you to look right past that shiny, polished facade of the American dream, question the actual historical realities of all this progress, and ask yourself, from the assembly line to the picket line to the firing line, who truly paid the price? Thanks so much for joining us, and keep questioning.